Before we begin, take a moment to slow down. Relax your shoulders. Unclench your jaw. Let your breathing become natural. There's nothing you need to do right now. Nowhere you need to rush. Just listen. This is a story about the future. About intelligence and about a question humanity is only beginning to understand. So sit back, focus, and let's begin. The scientific anatomy of the Bermuda Triangle myth, or one of nature's cruelest tricks, part 1 of the triangle that became bigger than the ocean. There are places that frighten people because of what they have seen. And then there are places that frighten people because of what they think they have seen. The Bermuda Triangle belongs to the second kind. For decades, it has lived in the public imagination as a wound in the Atlantic, a stretch of sea where ships vanish without distress calls, aircraft disappear from clear skies, compasses turn traitor, and the laws of nature begin to feel negotiable. In popular culture, it is less a region than a mood: blue water, white clouds, silence on the radio, and then nothing. But the first scientific truth about the Bermuda Triangle is almost disappointingly plain. It is not an official place at all. The U.S. Board on Geographic Names does not recognize it as an official name. No authoritative map fixes its exact boundaries, and estimates of its size vary widely depending on who is drawing the triangle. Even the famous shape of Florida, Bermuda, Puerto Rico is more cultural shorthand than hard geography. That matters more than it seems, because the first step in building a legend is giving uncertainty a border. Once you draw this shape, people begin to fill it. A ship goes missing there, the triangle takes it. A plane disappears nearby, the triangle takes that too. The map becomes a mouth. The phrase itself is not ancient. Britannica notes that the term Bermuda Triangle was coined by Writer Vincent Gaddis in 1964 in Argosy, and the legend was then supercharged by Charles Perlitz, whose 1974 bestseller treated the region not as a navigationally difficult corridor, but as a place where Atlantis, unknown forces, and paranormal explanations could plausibly be invited into the story. Heavy traffic through the area and ordinary accidents existed long before the myth, but the myth gave them a stage, a name, and a script. And that is what made the triangle so powerful. It did not begin with data. It began with narrative gravity. A ship vanishes at sea, and the ocean already makes that feel supernatural. At distance, incomplete records, wartime reporting errors, weather gaps, and sensational retellings, and mystery begins multiplying faster than evidence can catch it. Over time, some incidents were exaggerated, some were stripped of their meteorological context, and some were folded into the triangle story even when the circumstances were less mysterious than later retelling suggested. Noah's summary is blunt. There is no evidence that mysterious disappearances occur more often in the Bermuda Triangle than in any other large, well-travelled part of the ocean. That sentence should have killed the legend. It did not, because the Bermuda Triangle was never only about statistics. It was about the emotional collision between a vast, dangerous ocean and the human need to believe that unexplained loss must point to something more than weather, error, or bad luck. A storm is hard to respect because it has no motive. A current is hard to fear in mythic terms because it has no face. But a devil's triangle that has intention. That can be remembered. Now imagine the region before it became a tourist brochure for the paranormal. A shipping corridor, flight paths, tropical seas, strong currents, sudden squalls, shallow banks in some areas, deep ocean in others. The Gulf Stream moving like a hidden river through the Atlantic. This is where the scientific anatomy begins. No points to several plain environmental factors that can explain many incidents associated with the Bermuda Triangle. The majority of Atlantic tropical storms and hurricanes pass through the region. The Gulf Stream can create rapid and sometimes violent changes in weather, and a large number of islands and shallow areas in the Caribbean create navigational hazards. Britannica adds that the Gulf Stream is a strong current running through the region and that tropical storms and hurricanes are frequent there. In other words, before anyone introduces aliens, time warps, or lost Atlantean machines, the region is already a difficult and high-risk operating environment for ships and aircraft. And difficulty at sea has a cruel talent. It can erase evidence. That is where the Gulf Stream becomes more than just background. No describes it as a powerful western boundary current that can move at about 1 to 3 knots. That may not sound dramatic on paper, but in an accident scenario it matters enormously. A fast current can disperse floating wreckage, move oil slicks away from the likely site of a loss, complicate search grids, and make an ordinary maritime disaster feel uncanny simply because the ocean refuses to leave a clean crime scene behind. What looks like vanished without a trace can in reality mean went down in a place where a trace is hard to keep. That is one of the most important scientific points in the whole story. The ocean is not required to return your dead. It is not required to preserve your wreckage. It is not required to explain itself on your timetable. And when people expect debris that never appears, mystery rushes in to occupy the gap. Now add waves. NOAA defines a rogue wave as a wave greater than twice the size of surrounding waves, so large, unexpected, and dangerous. It also notes that rogue waves can form when storm-generated waves interact with strong currents such as the Gulf Stream, which can focus wave energy and create steep, extreme seas. Britannica's Bermuda Triangle overview adds that the region's Atlantic setting, where storms from multiple directions can converge, has helped make rogue wave explanations part of the more serious natural discussion around the triangle. That does not mean every disappearance was caused by a rogue wave. It means the region contains physical ingredients capable of producing exactly the kind of sudden violence that sailors once described in language sounding almost supernatural. Picture it for a moment. Not monsters beneath the hull. Not a glowing portal in the sky. Just a wall of water rising where it should not rise, steep-sided, badly timed, and strong enough to break a vessel or cripple a smaller aircraft forced down into the sea. Nature does not need to be magical to be theatrical. It only needs to be fast. Then there is weather itself. The North Atlantic hurricane season runs from June 1 to November 30, and the wider Western Atlantic/Caribbean region routinely sits under the influence of tropical systems, fast-building storms, and dangerous marine weather. NOAA's marine safety guidance notes that the Gulf Stream can actually enhance sea states when it interacts with hurricane wind fields, making already hazardous conditions even worse for mariners. Long before modern forecasting, ships entering these waters were operating in a zone where the atmosphere could turn hostile quickly and the sea could respond violently. It disappeared in calm blue water is often how legends retell such cases. Caught by rapidly worsening weather in one of the busiest and most dynamic marine corridors on Earth is often closer to the scientific anatomy. And yes, compasses. Few parts of the Bermuda legend are as persistent as the idea that compasses go insane there. But the scientific version is much less paranormal. NOAA explains magnetic declination simply as the angle between magnetic north and true north, and notes that declination changes with location and time. NOAA's Bermuda Triangle page adds that there is some evidence the region can sometimes coincide with places where a magnetic compass points to true north rather than magnetic north and ergonic line effect, while Britannica notes that one long-standing natural explanation is that pilots or mariners failed to account properly for compass variation. In other words, there is no uniquely cursed magnetism in the triangle. There is ordinary geomagnetic complexity, the kind navigators are supposed to understand, and in the wrong circumstances, even small orientation errors can cascade into catastrophe. That detail is emotionally perfect for myth, because a compass is symbolic. When it fails, or seems to fail, it feels like the world itself has become untrustworthy. But from a scientific point of view, most compass stores in the triangle point less towards supernatural distortion and toward an old maritime truth. Navigation errors are deadly, especially when weather is worsening, fuel is finite, and land is farther away than the crew believes. No incident shows that better than Flight 19. In December 1945, 5 U.S. Navy TBM Avenger aircraft on a training mission disappeared after becoming lost off Florida, and a Martin PBM mariner sent to search for them was also lost. The case became one of the engines of Bermuda Triangle mythology. But later reporting and historical summaries consistently point toward navigational error, confusion about location, worsening weather, and fuel exhaustion rather than anything paranormal. History summarizes the incident by noting that the flight leader's compasses apparently malfunctioned and that he became severely lost. The U.S. Naval Institute retelling of the official account says Lieutenant Taylor likely mistook his location, believed he was over the Florida Keys rather than the Bahamas, and eventually led the flight farther from land until fuel ran out. The search aircraft's disappearance has often been attributed to an explosion, a known risk for the aircraft type when heavily fueled. And this is where the triangle begins to look less like an alien machine and more like a theatre where ordinary failure is amplified by unforgiving conditions. A pilot becomes disoriented. Weather degrades. Fuel shrinks. The ocean below offers no landmarks. Radio calls grow less confident. Then the story ends before certainty returns. That pattern is devastatingly human, which is exactly why people prefer the supernatural version. Because if the triangle is magical, then the losses mean something larger. If the triangle is natural, then the losses are often the result of ordinary vulnerability in extraordinary conditions. And ordinary vulnerability is harder to romanticize. By now, the scientific anatomy is already visible, a non-official region with elastic borders, a myth popularized by 20th century writers. Heavy air and sea traffic, fast currents that erase traces, storms, hurricanes, and dangerous marine weather, possible navigational confusion involving compass variation, rare but real rogue wave conditions, and above all, the simple fact that the Atlantic is allowed to be deadly without becoming supernatural. So part 1 ends not with a solved mystery, but with a reframed one. The Bermuda Triangle may not be a hole in reality, but it is something else, and perhaps something more interesting, a place where myth took shape because nature was already violent enough, complicated enough, and visually deceptive enough to feel like a conspiracy. The ocean did not need a devil. It only needed weather, current, distance, and human error and history did the rest. Part 2, the myth dissected. The ocean, amongst the most persistent legends, do not survive because they are true. They survive because they satisfy. The Bermuda Triangle satisfies a certain human hunger, the desire to believe that unexplained loss is never merely loss. That if a ship vanishes, or a plane does not come home, then perhaps the universe itself leaned in and touched the event. Perhaps there was a pattern, perhaps a hidden machine, perhaps a force, perhaps something older than maps. Science is less generous than that. Science asks a colder question. What if the region is dangerous, but not exceptional? That is, in many ways, the core conclusion of the best official sources. No says plainly that there is no evidence disappearances happen with greater frequency than in any other heavily traveled ocean area. The agency also notes that the U.S. Navy and U.S. Coast Guard rejects supernatural explanations, attributing maritime losses instead to the combined effects of nature and human fallibility. Britannica echoes that point, stating that boaters and flies continued to move through the region routinely and safely, and that geophysical and environmental factors are the most likely explanations for the incidents that gave rise to the legend. That finding should not make the story smaller. It should make it sadder, because now the triangle stops being a haunted zone and becomes something more brutally realistic. A place where ordinary mistakes are punished fast, where weather escalates without caring whether humans are prepared, and where the ocean's ability to remove evidence turns tragedies into folktales. This is why so many famous Bermuda incidents remain emotionally potent. Not because all of them are unsolved in some metaphysical sense, but because some of them are unsolved in the very ordinary sense, the deep water, time. And incomplete records do not always hand investigators a clean ending. Take the broad category of vanishings associated with the triangle. Ships such as USS Cyclops, aircraft such as Star Tiger, Star Ariel, and the DC-3 lost in 1948, and of course Flight 19. Britannica summarizes the region as one where more than 50 ships and 20 airplanes are said to have disappeared, but also emphasizes that the reported incidents span different eras, inconsistent boundary definitions, and a mix of genuinely uncertain losses with later embellishment. In some cases, weather mattered. In others, navigation and maintenance issues mattered. In still others, the loss became mysterious largely because wreckage was never recovered, which, in a vast oceanic corridor with strong currents, is tragic but not astonishing. And this is where one of the triangle's favourite false friends appears, the idea that no trace implies no natural explanation. It does not. The Gulf Stream alone is enough to complicate that logic. A current moving at 1 to 3 knots can displace debris and search clues far more quickly than popular imagination tends to allow, especially when combined with wind, storms, sinking dynamics, and time lost before the search begins. Add variable weather, depth, the sheer size of the possible search area, and the fact that some craft were small, lightly built, or operating near the edges of range and vanished without a trace begins to look less supernatural and more like a brutal feature of marine accident investigation. There is also a statistical illusion hiding inside the myth. The Bermuda Triangle is one of the most heavily travelled regions in the Atlantic, by both sea and air. Britannica's facts page explicitly notes the area has heavy daily traffic that moves through safely, while Norcold is a large, well-travelled area of the ocean. If traffic is dense, then incidents will also accumulate more visibly in the historical record. That does not prove the area is safe, it proves that rock counts alone are a poor measure of exceptional danger. A corridor with heavy traffic, violent weather, navigational challenges, and a mythology that encourages selective attention will naturally seem more cursed than a quieter region where fewer people are watching. That is the anatomy of legend in one sentence. High traffic plus harsh conditions plus missing evidence plus sensational retelling. Now let us dissect some of the scientific theories that people often use to preserve the triangle's mystique. One recurring idea is methane eruptions, so-called oceanic flatulence or burps of death. Noah's Bermuda Triangle explainer specifically mentions methane gas from ocean sediments as one of the ideas people have proposed, but adds a decisive phrase: such explanations may be grounded in science, if not in evidence. That wording matters. It means the theory is not pure fantasy in chemical terms, but it also means it is not backed by convincing evidence as the explanation for the triangle's famous disappearances. In other words, methane is part of the mythology's scientific costume, not part of its strongest evidentiary spine. Another recurring idea is that the triangle is uniquely cursed by magnetism, but again, the official sources do not support that dramatic leap. Magnetic declination exists worldwide. Compasses require correction because magnetic north and true north are not the same, and the relationship changes with location and time. The Bermuda region may sometimes intersect with an agonic line where the difference briefly narrows, but there is no evidence that this makes it a uniquely paranormal navigational zone. The scientific interpretation is much simpler. Navigation in complex weather over featureless water is difficult, and misunderstanding compass behavior can become deadly. Then there is the weather itself, which may be the most underrated suspect because it is so unglamorous. But NOAA, the National Hurricane Center, and Britannica all converge on the same point. This region is vulnerable to tropical storms, hurricanes, and rough sea states. The NHC specifically notes that the Gulf Stream can enhance hazardous seas when interacting with the hurricane's wind field. NOAA's marine services exist precisely because adverse winds, large seas, dense fog, and sudden marine hazards can become lethal for vessels and aircraft. In myth, this becomes the sky turns strange. In science, it becomes a region where atmospheric and oceanic energy routinely combine in dangerous ways. And that leads to one of the story's most unsettling conclusions. Nature does not need to be mysterious to produce mystery. A rogue wave can arrive like an ambush. A current can hide the wreck. A storm can erase the timeline. A pilot can misread his position. A ship can founder in conditions no one later reconstructs perfectly. From the outside, all of that can look like a curse. From the inside, it is just a terrible chain of physics and error. This is why the scientific anatomy does not debunk the Bermuda Triangle so much as strip it down to bone. The legend wants one cause. The real world offers many small, ugly causes working together. That is harder to sell, harder to film, and much harder to remember. But it is usually how real disasters happen. There is another important piece to the anatomy: depth and terrain. Britannica notes that the Milwaukee depth in the Puerto Rico Trench lies within the broader region often folded into the triangle, reaching approximately 27,493 feet, 8,380 meters. Not every incident occurred near such extreme depths, but the point is clear: parts of the broader area are not shallow, forgiving waters where wreckage is easy to locate. In deep ocean environments, especially before modern search technology, the sea could swallow craft and leave investigators with only fragments, if that. A myth fed by missing wreckage becomes easier to sustain when the search environment itself is so punishing. And what if the most dramatic claim of all, that something about the triangle is still genuinely unexplained? The careful answer is yes and no. Yes, in the limited sense that not every historical disappearance has been reconstructed in full detail. No, in the stronger sense that there is still no evidence requiring a paranormal, extraterrestrial, or law-breaking physics explanation. That distinction matters. Uncertainty is not the same thing as anomaly. We do not know exactly how this craft was lost is not the same as the region contains forces outside accepted science. Noah's language is crystal clear on this point, and official maritime experience supports it. There is no demonstrated increase in mysterious disappearances relative to comparable high-traffic regions. In fact, part of the triangle's power comes from how often uncertainty gets misread as evidence. A report isn't complete, therefore secretive. The wreck is missing, therefore impossible. The weather changed suddenly, therefore unnatural. The compass was confused, therefore magnetically cursed. But science is built precisely to resist that temptation. It does not reward the most dramatic explanation. It rewards the one that requires the fewest miracles. And in the Bermuda Triangle, miracles are almost never necessary. By now, the real anatomy is visible in full. The triangle is culturally famous but geographically loose. Its myth was popularized in the 1960s and 1970s by sensational writers. It sits in a heavily trafficked Atlantic corridor. It overlaps with hurricane and tropical storm routes. The Gulf Stream moves quickly enough to worsen seas and disperse evidence. Rogue waves are real and conform where currents and wave systems interact. Compass issues are real but ordinary, not supernatural. Human error remains central to major cases such as Flight 19, and no authoritative source has found evidence that the region is uniquely mysterious in statistical terms. So is the Bermuda Triangle a myth? Yes, if by myth we mean a supernatural explanation for a place that official science does not recognize as unusually paranormal or uniquely prone to unexplained vanishings. But is it only a myth? Not quite, because myths sometimes grow over real danger. And the natural forces in this corridor are real enough, violent enough, and evidence-destroying enough to keep producing stories that feel supernatural even when they are not. That may be the triangle's deepest secret. It is not a crack in the universe. It is a reminder that ordinary earth weather, water, current, depth, and human fallibility can still manufacture the same all people once reserved for gods and monsters. So this story ends where the strongest scientific stories often end, not with total magic, not with total certainty, but with a colder and more honest kind of wonder. A plane drifts off course. A storm closes in. A wave rises higher than it should. Current carries evidence away. The radio falls silent. And somewhere years later, a myth is born because nature was already dramatic enough to deserve one. That is the scientific anatomy of the Bermuda Triangle. Not a wound in reality. A wound in interpretation. And perhaps that is why the legend has survived so long, because it is easier to believe the Atlantic is haunted than to accept that the ocean, left entirely to itself, is already more than mysterious enough.